I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts, episode 17 of the podcast dedicated to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means necessary. So we kind of have a theme for this week's episode. It's a little bit the sit back and do nothing, and maybe that's the best you can do for yourself episode, which is nice for all you do nothing loafers out there. We'll explain, I guess, during the interview with Dr. Raza Naqvi, it will become clear what I'm talking about, and actually kind of on theme also for this episode this week in neuroscience. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. If you hang around until the end of the episode in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, I will tell you what I'm planning on adding to my own personal smart drugs repertoire as the next thing that I'd like to try. This is a smart drug that I have not tried before, but I'm soon going to have the opportunity to give a go to. So I'll let you know what that's going to be, and then of course later I'll let you know what my subjective experience of that particular drug is once that happens. I should also take this opportunity to introduce our newest member of the Smart Drug Smarts staff, who is the kitten Mimi. Mimi is about a 9-week-old kitten at this point. Ridiculously cute, as kittens tend to be, and of course, as the proud kitten father, I probably think she's cuter than she really is. But yeah, moving right along, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
All right. So, okay, you know how everybody's had this experience where, like, you have a friend that gets on some kick and they're trying to sell like a magazine club or something like that. And then they want all their friends and families to buy a magazine. And they send you something like, hey, look at this thing I'm really excited about. And you're like, oh God, I need to say something nice. Well, anyway, but then every now and then something happens where your friend sends you something and it's totally awesome. And you're like, wow, that's rad. Great job. I was lucky enough to have one of these latter type of experiences when a friend of mine named Avi Roy, who's over at Oxford University, so obviously he's a big smarty pants. He's a much bigger smarty pants than I am. But anyway, he sent me an article that he had just published and was like, hey, Jesse, what do you think about this? I'm about to put this out there. Wanted to see if you had any notes, I guess, before I go live. And I read it, and the article was totally awesome, and I thought it was relevant to listeners of this podcast as well. Specifically, it's about aging stuff, but since so many cognition things are aging relevant, since so much like smart drugs research is about how to stave off the effects of senile dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, rather than just aggressively making young people smarter. There's this giant sort of overlap between these two areas. So anyway, his article is entitled, "If You Want to Live Longer, Do Nothing." And basically it's sort of the point that he makes is that over the course of, your average, 70, 80 year human lifespan that we have nowadays, the number of life extension, fads that go into and out of vogue over the course of, what will be your lifetime is so huge. And, so many of them just at total loggerheads with one another that probably, the best move overall, is to sit back and do nothing other than, make the obvious choices that we know are going to be good for you. Like don't smoke, don't drink heavily, don't, play in the railroad tracks all the time, things like that. He's got this really interesting mortality curve. This is one of these, I'm kind of a data geek, but this was a chart that I just loved because it expresses a complex idea in a very clear visual way. Basically, it's showing the likelihood of any particular person living to a particular age based on when they were born. This is, it's a data subset from men in England and Wales born between, it was like 1860 and 2010. But anyway, obviously at the time of birth, everybody has a 100% chance of being alive. And by the time you're 125 years old, you pretty much have a 100% chance of being dead. But between those 2 points on the spectrum, the likelihood of being alive at any given age has changed quite a bit historically, over the course of the last 150 years. In this curve, the people born in 1860 had only a 20% chance of living to 70, whereas now living to 70 is relatively commonplace. And so you get to sort of see the fluctuations of where these changes have happened demographically. Anyway, I'm going to cut myself off here before I just tell you the whole point of the article, but really interesting article. I'm going to put a link to it on the website. I would definitely recommend checking it out. Avi is a very smart guy and somebody that you should be aware of as an author. I'm going to subscribe to all future stuff he writes because, the guy's he's spitting brain juice.
Smart Drug Smarts.
All right, and filed under things that I am sure to print out and put on my refrigerator for all to see, I got 2 5-star reviews on iTunes by folks in the last couple of weeks. One was by Alt229, who said, "Intelligent interviews, thought-provoking ideas, and catchy segments make this my new go-to podcast. I only wish that the interviews were longer." We may just be able to help you with that, Alt229. Alt229 spelled favorite with a U, which makes me suspect that he or she is one of our British listeners. So that's always kind of cool. And the Prince of Roswell said it was super informative, thought-provoking, high-quality, entertaining, and educational podcast. Totally awesome. This guy says, "I've listened to them all several times except for the vegan one. Never trust a man that doesn't eat bacon." Fair enough. Okay, well, anyway, moving along to the interview. Here we are talking with Dr. Raza Naqvi. And yeah, Dr. Naqvi wrote an article that came across my desktop not too long ago that I read the title and read the article and was like, wow, really? Is that true? Well, anyway, it piqued my curiosity, and the subject matter we'll, of course, get into in the interview, so I won't bear repeating it right now. But anyway, so I reached out to the doctor. He was nice enough to offer himself up for an interview, and I will throw you right into that now. So, Dr. Naqvi, I'd like to hear basically just some further elaboration on the article that I read about. Let me see actually where this was published.
Yeah, the Canadian Medical Association Journal.
Right. Yeah, and that was picked up, I guess, by the AP or something like that, and read the summary version. But this sounded like one of the exactly what everybody doesn't want to hear. It was kind of like you went down the list with a litany of things that people hope might help with their cognition, and kind of like, nope, not much evidence for this. Nope, not much evidence for that. But could you kind of give a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So first I'll tell you kind of what we did. So we did, it was a review. So what we did was we looked through all of the literature, basically from the inception of all of the various electronic databases of medical literature to present day when we finished our data kind of collection, and went through all of it looking for high quality trials, meaning like randomized trials, looking only at those with healthy older adults as their primary target. So these are not people with signs of dementia or early signs of dementia. These are people who have no signs of any cognitive impairment or anything like that. And we said, let's try to put a bit of evidence behind it. You know, there's a lot of general recommendations that doctors sometimes make, and then there's a lot of claims that either private companies or pharmaceutical agents or other people may make as to what their products can or cannot do. So we thought we'd try to put a bit of evidence behind that. So we reviewed all that literature. We boiled it down to 32 studies that met our criteria. We started off with over 5,000, kind of narrowed it down. And what we found, I don't think it's all bad news. I know some ways to look at it is that way, but I actually think it's a bit more positive than that. So if I'm going to boil down the conclusions, then I can elaborate further if you'd like.
Yeah.
First, I would say one of the big conclusions is in all of the pharmacologic, so medication-related therapies that have been either trialed or supposed to help in preventing memory loss in people with normal memories, none of them have any good quality evidence. So that goes from prescription meds to herbal products to some vitamins and other things that have been studied, and I can go in more detail if you'd like later. So that's number one. So there's no evidence that would help, but I think there's a positive spin to that there's sometimes people on some products, herbal products, prescription meds, other things, suffering some side effects, but saying, you know what, this is probably helping my memory, so I want to stay on it. And now we have some good evidence to say, you know, maybe you don't need to suffer through those side effects. Maybe it's not making any difference.
Sure. And for a lot of people, it probably is not helping their wallet either, because sometimes people can spend a lot of money on these things that have, you know, questionable evidence behind them.
Absolutely. And especially seniors who are often on fixed incomes with pensions and other limited source of income, spending a good chunk of that on unproven therapies isn't kind of the best way to go about things, I think. So that's one part of it. The other part is looking at, okay, so if medications don't work, have other things been studied? So there's two other big categories that were studied. One was what I like to call mental exercise, or looking at cognitively stimulating activities. And there were basically 3 studies done looking at this with a variety of different techniques that they used. And even though they used different techniques and were over different durations and lots of differences between the studies, but they all consistently showed some benefit. So that goes from in-person training to computerized training to things like that. And they all consistently showed that, the memory in the group that was in the active arm of that study was better than those in the placebo arm. That's encouraging to say, we have some evidence that something that should have relatively no side effects, keeping your brain active in some way, has some potential benefit. And this is, everything comes with a word of caution, because we can say what the studies claimed, but to extrapolate beyond that is kind of getting out of evidence-based medicine and getting into what we would like to hope and perhaps may be true. And then the third part was looking at physical activity. So does physical exercise actually help normal, healthy older adults prevent cognitive decline? And the results there were a bit conflicting. There was one study that showed benefit, one that was equivocal, and another one that showed no benefit at all. So the jury's still out there, but we know many, many other benefits of physical exercise. So by no means am I saying not doing that. I'm saying it may not be just for your memory. There may be other benefits that might drive you to do that.
Sure. Now, I guess this is going to be hard to generalize because, as you said, there's a great number of different studies that you're sort of summarizing here. But were most of these dealing with applications of, things like exercise, things like pharmaceuticals, things like supplements that only began once the adult was already sort of, older in age, pushing their 50s, 60s, or were these like lifestyle choices from early on?
Yeah, so what our review specifically looked at is in the senior population. So we looked specifically at studies that only included, or the average age of patients included, was over 65. So none of these studies looked at people starting in their 40s, 50s. It's all, 65 or so plus. The average age was always over 65.
Gotcha. Let me couch that question a little bit differently. Would somebody be in the study if they had started doing something like, for example, let's say they started exercising in their 20s and they're 60 now and they're still exercising, but the exercise wasn't something that had begun late in life? Would that sort of person be within the study group, or was it only somebody that had been, primarily sedentary until their 60s and then began an exercise regimen?
That's a great question. So the studies that were done looking at, either physical or mental exercise did not exclude anyone based on prior physical or mental activity. So you could have been a marathon runner and physically very fit and then still get enrolled in the study. They all had certain exclusion criteria, but they're mainly based on, either pre-existing dementia, then you don't get included, but that's not what we're looking at in our population anyway. Or if it's a medication study, someone who's been on that medication recently or a similar medication recently. The one other thing I just want to mention when I was talking kind of about the big conclusions is one of the surprises, it shouldn't be a surprise because it's been in the literature, but is not widely known, is that some of the therapies that had previously been proposed to actually help with memory loss, maybe prevent memory loss, actually showed harm when they were reviewed in a kind of formal prospective manner with randomization and all of those techniques that help studies establish the quality. So that caught some people off guard, and they were, even personally, I've had patients who've been on these therapies thinking that it's helping, but when you look at the data a bit more carefully, it actually shows that it's hurting or potentially hurting them.
Wow. So what were some of these ones that had the negative effects?
Yeah, so there are 2 big categories. So the first one was actually estrogen therapy. So estrogen or estrogen and progesterone combination. The key point I want to mention just before I say the conclusions is these studies were on people who were not on these medicines for any other reason. So if you were on it because you have, perimenopausal symptoms or other things like that, you would not be included. So looking specifically at people who have no other indication to be on estrogen, the way it kind of started was in the late 90s, they put together a meta-analysis, basically put together all the studies that had been done on estrogen and said, there's some suggestion here and there that there's benefit. So let's put it all together and see. And there are 2 big studies that came out, and they showed that, there's about a 30% lower incidence of dementia in those who are on estrogen compared to those not on estrogen. So people start saying, there's potentially benefit, and some people ask for prescriptions, some were given by their physicians. But the important piece there is those meta-analyses that looked at all the studies looked at the only studies that had been done were not of the best quality. They were either looking backwards at data and trying to make associations, not looking at studies that were specifically designed to look at estrogen and memory, because those studies had never been done to that point. So then a group in the US started this big 10,000 plus patient study and said, now let's look at it objectively. People who have normal memory or women who have normal memory on estrogen or no estrogen, and let's evaluate their outcomes. And they actually found about a 1.8 times, so almost twice as much dementia in the group that was on therapy. So the exact opposite of what those previous studies had suggested. So it was surprising, and some patients of mine who started the therapies back then in the late 90s or so and kind of didn't stay up to date with the literature, or their doctors didn't stay up to date or whatever, I've still been on it. And even up till a few months ago, I've been educating people to say, the prevailing conclusion now is that they're actually more harmful than helpful if you have no other indication to be on it. So that was the big one. The other category, to be thorough, is the anti-inflammatories. There was one study done actually on two anti-inflammatories, one called naproxen and one called celecoxib, both commonly used in arthritis. And again, not used in the studies in people with arthritis, but just normal, healthy older adults to see, does it help prevent memory loss? And the conclusion, again, was there was a tendency towards harm, not as conclusive as the estrogen, but still a tendency in their studies, which were over about 3 years.
Why would people have been taking an anti-inflammatory solely for the prevention of memory loss? What led people to think that might be a good idea?
Yeah, so again, it comes back to looking at prior studies. So often there's database studies. So someone will look at a database and a lot of things are recorded in different medical systems, how many people are on certain medications and what diagnoses they may have. And there was a suggestion that maybe there is a benefit to an anti-inflammatory effect. So maybe you have less inflammation, it can have less damage in your brain, and there might be a tendency towards less dementia. It wasn't as conclusive as the estrogen studies I told you about before, but there was a hint towards it, and some people thought, if we bring down inflammation, we might improve brain health that way. So it was more of a open-ended question when this study was started, and then it's still, I wouldn't say absolutely conclusive. This was one study over 3 years, and the numbers were not impressive in terms of harm, but were definitely statistically significant, at least we can say.
So I guess sort of tying all this back around to what you would actually recommend for people who are interested in, maintaining their, cognitive health as strong and as long as possible. Like, what do you do for yourself? What do you recommend for your patients or people that you speak with?
The biggest thing are the simple things. And some of this has been recommended by, geriatricians or people interested in memory for years, but without the solid evidence base. So what I tend to say is try to maintain mental activity or keep yourself mentally stimulated as much and as long as possible. And although this isn't coming directly from the studies, I say whatever you seem to enjoy. So if you like crosswords, do crosswords. If you like doing certain activities on the computer or with friends or that sort of thing, continue doing it. So mental activity is kind of the cornerstone of my recommendations. Beyond that, I always mention physical activity as being important. And it's not based solely on the evidence for that I quote in the review that we published last month, but it goes back to all of the other benefits. And maybe there's some benefit that we just haven't caught up to. We haven't done the right studies. We haven't looked at it the right way yet. But definitely no harm when you do it in a supervised way. So mental activity, physical activity. And the third key point I tell them is if you're on a prescription or non-prescription medication solely for the purpose of improving your memory, I try to look at it critically with them and say, you know what, is there any chance you're having some side effects from this? What are the benefits? Have you noticed any benefits? And if it's one of the ones that have been studied, I tell them that, we've looked at this and there either has or hasn't been benefit. I try my best to take people off as many medications as possible because even though there's not common side effects, I think you put enough things together and you're bound to have some effect somewhere.
Something like memory is so difficult for people to subjectively really tell what's making a difference to. It's like if every time you can find your car keys, do you count that as a plus? It's just like, it's incredibly difficult to know what's really affecting you.
And the whole concept of a placebo effect to whatever you're taking, whereby just taking the pill maybe makes you more confident or feel that your memory's better, is there. And they actually did one formal study looking at people getting a placebo pill, so basically a sugar pill, and people getting nothing. And the authors claim that there was an improvement in short-term memory, although if you really look at their article critically, there's no real difference. But there's a suggestion that it might just be the act of taking something that makes people more confident and perform better on these tests that are sometimes used to evaluate.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, this might be totally off topic, but anecdotally, or as far as your gut instincts, since I think a lot of the listeners to this podcast tend to be younger people that are really interested in, amping up their cognitive performance, while they're still in their, teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and, aren't even beginning to think about what it might be like to be in a, late life senescent decline. What about people in those ages? Anything that they can do to keep themselves as mentally sharp as possible?
Yeah, so I'd say two things. So one, the first part of what I've said is relevant for their older family members, parents, aunts, uncles, that sort of thing. But for the younger population, although not directly out of my study, there are a few things that have been shown to be somewhat protective. And you can imagine it's very hard to study these things formally. So you can't really put people in two groups and say, you get more education, you get less education. Let's see where things turn. But there is evidence that the more education you have, the more protected you are. And it's all about the whole concept of the brain, of being connections between different areas of your brain. And the more connections you build, the less likely you are to suffer decline when maybe one or two of those go down as you start to get older and suffer some of the unavoidable consequences of getting older. So one is trying to keep yourself as educated, whether that means formal education or staying well-read or listening to interesting podcasts or that sort of thing.
Even the school of hard knocks.
There you go. Anything you can do to keep your brain active, I think, is key. The other thing that's interesting, and if people want to take something tangible out, is that there's several studies showing an association between knowing multiple languages and being fluent in multiple languages and having a lower incidence of dementia later in life. So people who travel or going to different places and want to try to pick up that language a bit before they go, that sort of thing. If you're looking for something concrete to do and, you don't feel like spending another $50,000 doing a master's in something is quite your cup of tea, then that's something you can do on your own, learn, and maybe definitely protective down the road.
Great. Tying back a little bit to dietary stuff, since you didn't find much evidence for things like vitamin supplements, you mentioned, ginkgo biloba, vitamin B6, omega-3 fatty acids, even, which are, one of the things that are often trumpeted as being, brain food and sort of these necessary precursors for a lot of the way the brain rebuilds itself. Are you saying diet doesn't matter? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Like, obviously you're not saying diet doesn't matter, but it seems to hint that you think it matters maybe less than we're commonly told.
So I think there's a couple of kind of key points there. So one, I think diet is very important. So having and we know this with definite evidence in patients who actually have already evidence of cognitive decline or dementia. We know that having a healthy, balanced diet, and whether you say Mediterranean diet or you say any other specific type of diet, it's about having balance and variety in the foods you take, not just having tea and toast every day, all day. That definitely has benefits. So that's been proven in multiple different types of studies. What our review actually looked at specifically was what's been studied in a randomized fashion. So for that, you have to imagine somebody needs to invest some money into the study, number one. They have to say, I'm willing to spend X amount of money to say, does vitamin B6 work? And if you look at some of the studies in more detail, they're not all the best quality. So the vitamin B6 study, for example, only 12 weeks long, only 76 patients that they looked at. There's a strong, they found no positive association, but who's to say that if they had 5,000 people over 10 years, that would be the same result? I have no idea. So I'm not necessarily saying don't do these things and don't take them. I'm saying the evidence doesn't really support that. And if you want to do it because you think omega-3 is helping you for your cardiovascular health, for example, or something else, absolutely keep doing it. Just realize that you're paying whatever amount you're paying and the evidence isn't quite there. So the makers may say that, this definitely helps. If you wanted to look at the evidence critically and say what did those studies, positive studies, actually show and how did they show it? It's not really that convincing.
Right. Okay. That's a really, really good distinction that you made there. And I want to highlight that for sure. It doesn't mean these things don't work. It just means that it's, the evidence isn't there to prove it yet.
The other point that I didn't speak about explicitly in the article, but is important for people to realize is something about publication bias. And this is interesting. A lot of younger listeners and younger people are sometimes critical of pharmaceutical industry and other industries as trying to monopolize the system, trying to be all about profit. If you actually look at where studies are published, it is without a doubt true that positive studies with prescription medications are more likely to be published, and negative studies with herbal or other products are more likely to be published.
That's it. That is interesting.
It is interesting. And there were actually some authors who looked at this in Germany specifically, and they said if there was a positive study looking at a prescription medication made by whatever pharmaceutical company, and they have English and German language literature there, and they said, where is it more likely to be published? And they found that English language journals was the answer. And if there was a positive study looking at, complementary therapies, acupuncture, herbal products, etc., where is it more likely to be published? And the answer was in German language journals. So there is definitely this bias for whatever reason. And I think it's important for the informed listener and the informed consumer to be aware of this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many wheels within wheels that you need to think about when you're trying to decide what you're going to, be putting into your own body or doing for your own brain.
I think the bottom line for people to take from this is to try to have a positive outlook. We're not saying that nothing works. We're saying keep your brain active, stay physically active, and if you're on pills specifically just to maintain your memory, look at it again critically, maybe with your doctor if you have a doctor you trust, and say, is this really helping me or am I having some side effects maybe I can avoid by stopping?
All right. So thank you very much to Dr. Naqvi for that interview. And yeah, that kind of concludes our sit back and do nothing because maybe that's the best thing that you can be doing kind of episode. It's actually kind of contrary, I guess, to the main thrust of this podcast, which is looking for a sort of aggressive self-betterment ways. I feel like this episode is a ideological hat tip to a book that's sort of on the tip of the tongue. Well, a book can't really be on the tip of the tongue, but everybody that I banter with about intellectual stuff is talking about this new book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, I think that's how his name is pronounced, called Anti-Fragile. Anyway, a lot of folks are reading it. The idea is essentially that leave well enough alone, because when you try to make a small adjustment to something to fix the one thing that you see as a problem, there might be unforeseen second and third order consequences that are going to be much worse than the problem you're trying to fix. And certainly messing around with complex systems is always a dangerous game. I mean, there's more ways to break something complicated than there are to improve it. And that certainly seems to be the case. But on the other hand, progress is made by those few successful attempts at improvement of already complex systems. So hopefully those of us on the Smart Drug Smarts bandwagon will continue to damn the intellectual torpedoes and go full speed ahead towards whatever kind of crazy intellectual cognitive future science holds for us. Anyway, moving right along to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so I'm about to do some traveling, and I'm about to travel to a country where I can fairly easily get mailed to me something which I can't at my current residence, but it is the drug Deprenyl. Deprenyl is a drug which is prescription only in most places, but it is considered a nootropic. It has also anti-aging properties to it. This is something which is, I'm going to go for memory here, but the guy that discovered it, or rather the sort of first popularized it, he did some early studies on it with rats and gave it to middle-aged rats and found that by giving, I guess what was considered the effective dose for rats to rats that were already in rat middle age, he was able to increase their rat lifespan by 35%. So that's pretty impressive, because it wasn't even like giving them to baby rats, straight out of the womb. This is like a middle-aged rat, and you're still making it live 35% longer than its average peers. Subsequent studies with other animals, including dogs, have shown similar lifespan gains, although none quite as dramatic as that 35%. But yeah, Deprenyl, it's basically shown to be a mood booster, a cognitive enhancer, kind of turns up the dials of a lot of interesting things. I will probably do a Deprenyl episode later on, so I won't go into details about it now, but it is something I'm going to get my grubby little mitts on and give a good college try to. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
All right, so that is episode number 17, cruising in for a landing. Thank you very much for hanging out to the end. If you liked what you heard, please tell your friends. And also, if you're feeling just overly zealous in your love for this show, then head over to iTunes and see if you can leave a positive review to help other people that are podcast surfing, stumble across this easier. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that I talked about here. And I'll be back same time next week, same podcast, and the same unflagging commitment to fine-tuning the performance of your own brain. I should actually go on the record now at this point and say that I think it's going to be 11 a.m. on Wednesdays. East Coast time in the U.S. is going to be when we actually release this on a weekly basis. So if you want to set your second hand on your clock or whatever to be downloading at the exact optimum moment to download, then yeah, that should be Wednesday mornings. Of course, if you're like most people and you just listen to podcasts whenever you get around to it, then I'll catch you whenever. Right now it's what is it? It's 1:00 in the morning on Tuesday as I record this, so we don't keep any real schedule around here. But yeah, have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.